Hello there, welcome back to the Non-Serviam podcast. I'm Lucy Steigerwald, and here in the digital studio is Chris Coyne. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, thank you so much for meeting with me today.
Well, it was either you or go downtown Pittsburgh and stare at J.D. Vance, and I already feel good about my choice.
I appreciate it.
So, okay. Christopher Coyne is a professor of economics at George Mason University, the associate director of the F.A. Hayek program for advanced study in philosophy, politics, and economics at the Mercatus Center, and the director of the Initiative for the Study of a Stable Peace, ISSP, through the Hayek program. He's also a senior fellow at the Independent Institute and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute. He serves as the co-editor of the Review of Austrian Economics and of the Independent Review. He is the author or co-author of literally too many books to list, but the most recent one is How to Run Wars, a confidential playbook for the national security elite. Before that, it was In Search of Monsters to Destroy, The Folly of American Empire and the Paths to Peace. And before that, Manufacturing Militarism, U.S. Government Propaganda in the War on Terror. So people who are not familiar are getting the idea of what his focus often is. And sometimes you write with friend of the podcast, Nathan Goodman, I believe, who I do know in real life.
Yeah, that's right. Nathan was a student of mine, a dissertation student here at George Mason, and now my colleague and good friend. So
Very good.
he's a wonderful thinker, and I'm lucky to know him.
I'm a fan. Okay, so I guess we like to start with you. Kind of what if I ask you at a party, demand to know your politics, how you might describe yourself, and if there was any kind of journey to get here.
Yeah, I don't know if, I guess you could describe my politics. One way to put it would be, an individualist. Another way might be an anarchist, an anarcho-capitalist, a volunteerist, uh, small L libertarian, depending how people define it. I guess the way I think about my own politics, rather than a category or label, is kind of some principles or animating features, and then people can kind of box me in wherever they want, I guess. And those features would go something like the primacy of the individual. That by that I mean the individual has property rights over their person, their mind, and any property that they justly acquire, and also the ability of people to engage in creative self-governance. So the ability of people to form, maintain, extend human relationships with other people, uh, to form horizontal ties. I say horizontal to contrast it, of course, with vertical or top-down coercive relationships, and to figure out ways to navigate situations of conflict peacefully. Now, of course, that doesn't always happen. The conflict sometimes breaks down into violence, but I have a strong belief that people are able to figure things out if left to their own devices. And what that will look like exactly, I don't know. And that's part of the reason I'm skeptical of other people thinking they can know, and also believing that individuals themselves do know. So this commitment to normative individualism, the ability of people to leverage their creativity in a whole host of different settings, and a strong skepticism of any kind of top-down control or authority or coercion, whatever you want to call it. Those are kind of the principles that animate my larger belief system. And so I can see those to differing degrees fitting into a whole group of different kind of political philosophies or political categories, but that's how I would summarize it.
Okay, and but like, were you ever anything different?
So
Yeah.
the journey. I don't have a. I feel like I should have a more exciting journey.
I don't really have an exciting journey
Yeah,
either. It was
I grew up in a household that was wonderful family, conservative leaning, so Republican conservative leaning. But politics was never a huge part of our family or our dinner table talk, anything like that. And so if you asked me for most of my life, I would say I was kind of apolitical, meaning I didn't have. If you had asked me the same question you started with decades ago, I wouldn't have had an answer for you. I would sort of said like, this isn't something I think about. Interestingly, a lot of people get it. So I'm trained as an economist. I did my graduate work in economics. I teach economics, and a lot of people get into the economics or political science side of things through political philosophy. So they'll be exposed to thinkers from who are libertarians or anarcho-capitalists. And of course, some people come at it from more left-leaning thinkers as well, and that's all fine and good. And then they find their way to study an academic discipline. I was actually the reverse. I came across thinkers like Ludwig von Mises, F.A. Hayek, James Buchanan, Gordon Tullock first, and their intellectual work first. And that was as a junior, as an undergraduate student at Manhattan College, my junior year. And that's what really got me excited about economics. And then as I continued to read those thinkers and then do research on people related to them, then I came across thinkers like Ayn Rand, Murray Rothbard, and Rothbard had a huge influence on me, David Friedman. And then from there, I just kept building out to read more and more. And so it wasn't until, towards the end of my undergraduate education and then into my 20s and 30s when I really started carefully studying and thinking about and reflecting upon these deeper issues. And that's kind of what has led me to where I am now. I've been influenced by a whole host of different thinkers since then. But to the extent I have a journey, that's it.
How, well, this is, since you're so economically focused, this might be a giant question, but how does the fact of economics and economic questions influence your politics specifically, like applied to anarchism, let's say, or individualism?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think it influences it in several ways. One of them is that economics provides a way of thinking about the world. And so it provides an overarching framework for thinking about individual action, but also interactions between people. And that goes beyond the narrow. When I say the narrow, I mean, if you ask most people what's economics, they'll say, oh, money and profits and trading things against money. And of course, all those things are relevant. But when you step back and realize that human interactions certainly take place in a space that oftentimes involves monetary interactions, that involves profit and loss, many of them do not. And economics is still applicable there. So then we can start to think about the various economic aspects of human behavior and human relationships more broadly. And that doesn't just go for individuals exchanging with others to benefit them, but also the formation of rules, the formation of arrangements that allow people to engage in subsequent peaceful interactions with others. And so what I have done in my own work is tried to leverage the economic way of thinking to focus both on peace, on the formation of peaceful relations between people, but then also to apply those insights to how government operates, to understand how government operates not just in general, but specifically in areas of what I'll call war making. And by that term, I use it very broadly to include all the preparation for war, the policy talk about war, the actual execution of war, and then whatever post-war situation there is to the extent it exists. And I think economics is quite powerful for understanding those things as well. And the final thing I'll mention here is, my study of economics and the thinkers that have influenced me. One of the really powerful things, and this isn't just economists, this is the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers as well. So Adam Smith, David Hume, and others, Adam Ferguson. One of the things they emphasized is the centrality of emergent or spontaneous orders to human life. And that has really influenced my thinking because one of the things when you really get your head around this concept of emergent orders or spontaneous orders, what you realize is that each of us pursuing our own goals through interactions with other people can contribute to and do contribute to these broader overarching orders, which no one designed and which no one could design. And the reason I say that's influential on me is going back to what I was saying earlier. Once you realize that order and the coordination and cooperation that can generate that order without anyone designing it, it opens up a new set of interesting things to consider about the world. One of them is the power of people to generate expansive orders without anyone guiding it. A second is a deep skepticism of claims that top down control is necessary for order, but also claims that if you give power to a small group of people over these complex aspects of the world, that they're going to do a better job. And more often than not, if not always, they don't just do a worse job, but they actually do severe and oftentimes irreparable harm to a human well-being. And so that has certainly influenced my own thinking and the way I approach these various issues.
In terms of all that you just said, I feel like I could see how that applies to war making, specifically, say, the invasion of Iraq. But I don't know if you could elaborate on that, if you see where I'm going with that.
Yeah, certainly. Going back to your earlier question about my journey, I can return to that because all of this kind of fits together in a way, even though perhaps ironically I never planned it that way. It just kind of evolved that way. Uh, uh, but so I went to school undergraduate in New York City at Manhattan. I grew up outside New York City. Went to school in New York City at Manhattan College in Riverdale, New York. And again, if you had asked me when I started school, what are your views? What do you want to do? I didn't have strongly. I had views, but no kind of systematic views. And I would have told you I wanted to work in finance on Wall Street. And if
Hmm.
you had asked me why, I just would have told you that I wanted to make lots of money, and that seemed like a good way to do it. And so originally at Manhattan College, I pursued a finance degree. And I actually started working at JP Morgan down on Wall Street my junior year. And so I would go to class in the morning, get on the subway, go down to Wall Street, work, and then come back for night classes. My junior years, when I met my colleague, my now colleague, he was my teacher and dissertation advisor, Pete Betke, who introduced me to Mises, Hayek, Buchanan, Tullock, and others. And that's when I got interested in this stuff. After I graduated from Manhattan College, that would have been 1998 or 99. I worked in finance for 2 years, and so there's a reason I'm telling you this more than just background, which is Wall Street was 2 blocks from the World Trade Center.
Yeah.
So my first year in graduate school here at George Mason University, which is in Northern Virginia, about 15 miles from the Pentagon's where I'm sitting right now. The third week of graduate school is the 9/11 attacks. So the World Trade Centers get hit where I just come from. Pentagon gets attacked. I'm in Northern Virginia. What happens? The U.S. government unleashes the war on terror, including the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq. And that turned into my dissertation purely by uh, 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 a serendipitous conversation with one of my teachers, which was, I was talking to Tyler Cowen. I was his research assistant my first year. And I said something in passing, like, no one's talked, because remember the people forget like the grandiose claims of the Bush administration in Iraq and Afghanistan. We know about all the screw ups, but if you go back and look at like the actual claims, I mean, talk about heroic claims. We're going to overthrow the regimes, get rid of the bad guys, rebuild democracy, spread liberalism, and it's going to cost American taxpayers next to nothing. And we'll do this in a matter of months. It was supposed to be we're going to be in and out. That was the rhetoric.
Did they really
Uh,
say next to nothing? That part I don't remember.
yes, so
That's
so it was going to be it was good. The oil revenues were going to pay, and actually, I forget the guy's name. There was someone in the Bush administration who was fired because he went on TV and said something like, "Don't worry, it's only going to cost $50 million or something like that. Like it's not going to cost a lot of money to do this." And they're like, "You can't say that. It's
yeah.
gonna, it's not gonna cost the American taxpayers anything. The oil revenues will offset any costs." And anyway, I remember saying to Tyler, like, "Look, no one's talking about what I consider to be like basic things, like." Can you just export democracy? Forget about the ethical and moral aspects of invading countries. Let's just hold that. Those are important questions, by the way. But is a true liberal society, I'm not talking about like holding elections, like a
Hmm.
self-governing society based on the principles of individual freedom, is that something you can just like plop down wherever you choose to plop it down? And then what incentives would be required in order to pull this off? And so that turned into my dissertation, which was a study of U.S. efforts to export democracy using military occupation, and that really kind of set the stage for my research program since. And so in that book, what I did is I took the tools of economics, things like knowledge constraints, incentives, unintended consequences, and looked at different instances of U.S. military occupation with an attempt to understand that topic. And that's just one illustration of how economics can apply. Since then, I've continued to look at those issues, but also effects domestically on domestic life as well. Effects on the economy when the U.S. government maintains and operates its large scale military apparatus, the permanent war economy, the costs of maintaining a enormous empire abroad. Again, with an eye towards highlighting for readers what all of these costs entail, what it looks like. And it's not just monetary costs when I say costs, by the way, it's costs in terms of loss of life, loss of limb, loss of liberties, and so on. And those are all things that I've kind of tried to emphasize and highlight along the way as a scholar, and things I try to continue to highlight.
I feel like making you try to do like an elevator pitch for economics to like a random social anarchist that you encounter, like someone who probably thinks that uh, the worst version, like you say markets, and they probably think just cutthroat capitalism, cronyism, and things like that. And can you sell economics as important to, I mean, you just kind of did with foreign policy stuff, but somebody who doesn't even think about it in the kind of terms that an economist does? Like, why does it matter to the common person who cares about stuff but doesn't understand it, I guess?
Yeah, that's an important point. So let me try my best off the cuff here. I think I'd highlight a couple points. First, I'd highlight that economics is the study of individual human action. So, to the extent you are concerned with understanding the human world, economics is central. Now, let me just say a little more about that. Economics applies to the individual, but it also applies to interactions between individuals. So, for those who think that, for instance, markets are a dirty word, and I understand why they might think that, but let's just unpack that for a moment. The way I would put it is that markets are ultimately social spaces. They're social spaces because they are interactions between human beings. And so rather than thinking about markets in the abstract as this abstract thing that is operating out there, the way I think of it is a market is a emergent phenomena that is grounded in interactions between human beings. So even someone that is skeptical, let's say, of capitalism, there would still be markets to the extent there would be interactions between people that had to interact with one another in order to achieve their own goals, in order to advance the welfare of themselves and other people, and to get the things that they need and want. And so, from that standpoint, economics is quite powerful, even if we just stop there. And of course, there's a lot more we could say. But I think emphasizing that all which is tautological in a way, but it's easy to overlook. All human phenomena are grounded in human beings.
Yeah.
That's what I say when it's tautological, because it's true by definition. But
Hmm.
it's important to remember that, because it's very easy to abstract when we talk about the economy, markets, like, oh, these are just these things out there. But when we ground it in the human element, it's more realistic, but more powerful as well.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the initiative. You have too many things in your very impressive bio to ask about, but the initiative for the study of a stable peace is an intriguing title, and I was wondering if you could tell me about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's one of my newest kind of projects, and I'm excited about it. So thank you for bringing it up. So I have been working on these issues of war, peace since 2001. To go back to our earlier discussion, and in addition to my own teaching and research and writing, I've had the very good fortune of working with PhD students and as their dissertation advisor, as their co author, in many cases, not all. But as part of that, many of those students have kind of picked up on the various themes you and I have been discussing here. So applying tools of economics and political economy to issues of conflict, war, and peace. And about a year and a half, 2 years ago, it occurred to me I actually know a lot of scholars who are interested in these issues, and they were kind of dispersed. So I thought to myself, why don't I create kind of a community of these people where you don't have to share the same views on all issues. You don't have to be an economist to be a part of it. The shared commitment is to studying and understanding the foundations of a peaceful society. That's the where the stable peace comes from. Stable Peace is a title of a book by an economist named Kenneth Boulding, who had a major influence on me. We can talk more about him later if it interests you, but I'll stop there for now on Boulding. But that's where the stable peace part comes from. And so it's a virtual community of scholars. We do reading groups. We do workshops on academic papers. We do podcasts. And again, it's to create space for people who have a shared commitment to the systematic study of peace and nonviolence, and to create that community of scholars. I hope to continue to expand out the kind of activities that we undertake, but that's the main gist of what the initiative is all about.
Well, that sounds very nice. Makes me want to be a scholar. Well, your newest book is different from your other books. How to Run Wars, a confidential playbook for the national security elite, which you co-authored with Abigail Hall. And could you talk about that just a little bit,
Yeah,
and
so
how it's different from your previous books?
yeah, sure. Well, thank you. I'm glad I got to say something about it because for anyone listening who heard you just say the title, it might throw them off a little bit.
Yes, that's true.
This guy's skeptical of war and state war making, and now he's offering a guide to the national security elite for how to run wars. And so let me say right off the bat, the book is satirical. And I'll say a little bit more about it. You know, all of my work up to that point is largely, not entirely, but largely academic in nature. And much of it is with my co-author of this book, Abigail Hall, Abby Hall. She's a professor of economics at Tampa, University of Tampa, and she's another former graduate student of mine who came through the program here at GMU, and we've worked together on issues related to these topics since she was a graduate student, and we kind of never stopped. We work quite well together. And I was giving a talk somewhere and on war, and someone said to me after, you sound like Bruce Winton Knight, and I didn't know who that was. I had never heard that name, so I accepted the compliment, hoping that it was something good. Um, but then made a note of it and went home and looked up Bruce Winton Knight. And there's a reason I never heard of him. He didn't have any kind of major status or contribution to academics or anything big in the world that I would have known in the world I run in it that I would have known of, other than he was the brother of the famous Chicago economist Frank Knight, who was at the University of Chicago during the Department of Economics heyday there. So Frank Knight's brother, Bruce Winton Knight, he taught at Dartmouth. He was an economist. One of the books he published in 1936, this is Bruce Winton Knight, was called How to Run Wars.
Mm.
And I got my hands on it. It took me a while to track it down, and I just fell in love with it. And basically, he's writing this book in a satirical tone about running wars and kind of pointing out the absurdity of what's involved along the way. And I talked to Abby and I said, you got to read this book. So she read the book, and then I was like, we have to update this. This style. I just personally found it so amusing, but also jarring at the same time.
Hmm.
That's what I think good satire does. It kind of holds up a mirror for the reader to reflect upon the world and the practices that are being undertaken by pointing out the absurdity of them. and making you realize, like, yeah, that's actually absurd. So the book is written. This is why the title's How to Run Wars, a confidential playbook for the national security elite. It's addressed to the national security elite, and we offer them a guide to carry out a successful war. And so, just to give you a sense, the listener a sense, if you look at some of the titles: control the narrative, capture the media, prepare the sacrifices, embrace top-down economic planning, loosen the purse strings, silence dissent, ignore international law, and so on.
Yeah, that
Uh,
checks out.
yeah, right, exactly. So, and then at the end, we kind of come back in the conclusion and say, well, you got to keep this top secret from the public, because if the public sees this, they're going to realize all these terrible things you're doing to people. So don't let them do it. Sanitize war, and so on. And so the purpose of the book, it's relatively short and accessible. It's all of the examples, and from that standpoint, it writes itself, because all the absurdities we point out are all grounded in real things that most of them really post World War, post 9/11, even though we could have gone back even further. In some instances, we did for examples. So everything is documented in endnotes, so it is cited from that standpoint. But it's supposed to offer a non-academic reader, even though I think academics might find it of interest as well, insight into the horrors of war. So that's the purpose and goal of it. It was one of my favorite things I've ever written, in terms of just the style and the fun nature of satire. But that's kind of the project in a nutshell.
Is it going to be hard to go back to academia after doing the satire?
No, that part comes naturally, the academic part. So
Okay.
I've already returned to it, but this has opened for me a different way of thinking about things, and looking for kind of opportunities to communicate in different ways, which I think is quite important. It's very easy for academics to, of course, people understand kind of the ivory tower logic, to kind of stick to ourselves and talk to ourselves, but it has given me a new appreciation for figuring out ways to communicate with different audiences.
Can you kind of talk about the change in the temperature in terms of the US opinion on wars? If I was going to generalize horribly, I would say sort of a neoconservative attitude has shifted to a quasi paleoconservative attitude, and there is certainly more rhetorical. Oh, war! We shouldn't have any more wars. Can you talk about that change and whether you think it's substantial, whether good and or bad or both came with that?
Yeah, that's a big question, but let me just say a few things on it, and then we can kind of go off that if you want, or move on. The So the way I think about it is largely in line with what how you just laid it out, which is 2000s, 9/11, 2000s, neocon. I mean, again, 9/11 happens, and very quickly there are the scope of activities undertaken when you reflect back on it is truly staggering, just how quickly things moved. And of course, part of the reason is that people had been thinking about this stuff for a long time. By people, I mean neoconservatives broadly understood. There was a desire to go abroad, a desire to target certain countries in the Middle East, to carry out regime change, to create client states, to engage in imperialism, and so on. And so, in a sense, it makes perfect sense that it moved so quickly, because the groundwork had been laid, and the 9/11 crisis provided the opening to implement the plan, if you will. Uh, and of course, through much of the Bush presidency, public support was quite high. Certainly, right after 9/11, it was through the roof. Public
Yep,
support was, if you look. In some sense, well, an interesting question from a social science, political science standpoint is, why weren't things even worse? Like, it's actually amazing that you know people were calling for nukes, the use of nukes, and so on, but there was
mhm,
some restraint. I use that term loosely here, compared to completely unconstrained action. I don't want to downplay the scope of what actually happened, but I remember looking back at the polls. I'm like, darn, right after 9/11, I bet you Bush could have done even a lot more if he had really wanted to.
I agree.
Uh, uh, but then what happens, of course, is you get ebbs and flows.
Mm-hmm.
in public support. And you do get this shift, as you noted, which is as it became increasingly evident, which took a while because of government, I would argue, effective government propaganda on the part of the US government about Iraq and Afghanistan and what was happening in these places. But eventually, public support started to wane for them. You get an interesting shift, and part of this is the people realizing, I think, that those places had turned into quagmires, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also, of course, the rise of Trump
Mm-hmm.
and the MAGA movement, I think, had a big influence. And so, what do you get now? Well, interestingly, neoconservatives have kind of pivoted to Democrats.
Yeah.
So they are, and you see this right now with Harris, the Harris campaign openly kind of flaunting the fact that Bush era neocons are now supporting the Harris campaign, which is kind of interesting. But you get an interesting pushback against war now from many Republicans, not all of them, in some cases. In some cases. Now, here's my issue to the extent that I might have multiple issues, but I'll just highlight one for now, which is my sense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts if you think this makes sense or if I might very well be missing something in this or it might be incomplete. My sense is they're anti to the extent they have anti-war rhetoric. I'm talking about the MAGA people,
Mm-hmm.
and I realize I'm lumping together a lot of people, so there's always a risk in doing that, but I'll do it nonetheless, given that caveat. It's surface level,
Yeah.
meaning there's not a deep, systematic commitment to certain principles, whether they are ethical principles, whether they are practical principles about the nature of war making, the enterprise itself, the horrors of war making. Rather, it is a strategic use of we don't want to be going to war here. But if you listen carefully, we do want to go to war over there. And on top of that, of course, there's another form of very proactive war making going on and it's being advocated for, and I consider it war making, which is economic protectionism,
Mm, okay.
which to me is a form of warfare.
Yeah. I am reminded of, I believe, a Sheldon Richman piece from some years ago, sort of trying to address the idea of like, can you be a bigoted libertarian in some way? And I believe, and I hope I'm not misconstruing him by anything, but I believe it's basically said you kind of can, but the foundation is very weak. You know, like the you have no principle, so you say I'm not going to mess with anybody, but I have these beliefs, and the foundation for that is rotten, basically. Um, so I'm now wondering if sort of the rhetorical nods to war bad, but as you say, that like there's no deep principle or moral or practical principle there. So to me, I feel like that's kind of what's happening now. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and of course the problem with that, there's many problems with it, but one of them is that when you lack the core commitment to a set of principles, then it's like a leaf blowing in the wind. It's whatever the kind of the flavor of the week is, or whatever's happening today. I'm anti-war on this. Tomorrow, all of a sudden, I want full scale war, and there's no kind of guardrail or check to that because it's whatever is politically popular and feasible, or either broadly or in your head and amongst your core group of people. But that just means that you've concentrated again an enormous amount of discretionary power in the hands of a small group of people who can simply just indulge their preferences wherever those go. So um, because I have been asked before, well, aren't you happy now that there's kind of this pushback against war by Republicans? And I'm like, well, obviously, all else constant, I prefer less war to more. So if you said do I like that part? Yeah, but my fear is this lack of a systematic set of principles that it's grounded upon, and which means that the sustainability of it is highly questionable. But we'll see.
Yeah, I think that's true. And you just sort of get into a feedback loop of reactionary sort of, you're making Democrats more likely to be, I love the national security, I love the FBI because they're vaguely in conflict with Republicans now. So, but none of it has any foundation at all. And I, if I can be so bold, deporting like 15 million people would be a militarized action, even if it took place in, within the bounds of the United States. Things of that, suggested policies of that nature, you can't pretend that has anything to do with peace. So I don't know. Maybe there's a lack of actually being pro peace, even if there's an occasional rhetorical anti-war thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Our mutual friend, we were discussing him earlier, Nathan Goodman. He did his dissertation on this very topic of state surveillance and control over borders.
Hmm.
And I think it's wonderful work because it highlights exactly the type of point you were just making. So I very much appreciate you bringing it into the conversation, which is any kind of any kind of state intervention into an otherwise peaceful activity, either individually or between people, is going to require coercion
Hmm.
and backstop by force or the threat thereof. And so from that standpoint, it is entangled with the tools of war making, surveillance, weapons, imprisonment, fines, murder, all of these type of things, and you can't escape that. And so that's an important point to keep in mind when people, because again, we think about war, we say, okay, we're not going to go over there and start a large scale, land war.
Hmm.
But there's many other margins. You've highlighted an important one where governments are at war both with their own people and with others on a daily basis. And we should never lose sight of that. It's easy to in the daily kind of political discourse because we take certain things as like, oh, that's just how it is. Or that's a lot of people say like, that's how it has to be. That's what governments do. But we have to remember what the nature of the activity and the beast actually is.
So, do you think, I'm about to start asking about Robert Higgs and the Ratchet Effect slash Boomerang Effect, but I don't know if this is a Ratchet Effect in terms of the idea of anti-war. Is there any progress in actuality on this? Do you think? Because I honestly don't know. I'm reminded of. I'm just going to shout out some of my favorite anarchists. I feel like Anthony Gregory, who you probably know, um, used to argue that like Ronald Reagan-esque sort of faux libertarianism was worse than not having that because it tied those things together and subsequently sullied them. And I think there's at least something to that. So if MAGA becomes the anti-war group, do you feel insane? I mean, I feel a little insane being like, but I don't believe them because that sounds tepid. But is there anything there at all? I don't even know. Is there any progress on this idea, even a little bit?
Yeah. Again, I think it depends. I think it's hard to answer that. Here's what I mean. I could imagine a scenario where because there are certain aspects where the MAGA people are skeptical of war, that either influences a younger person, it actually leads to less war where otherwise it might have taken place on a certain margin. And from that standpoint, then you've made progress. But the point you raised about the linking these things with Reagan, I think, is important. One of an economist who I very much like, and we talk about a lot here at George Mason. His name's Don Lavoie, and he wrote a wonderful book in 1985 called National Economic Planning: What Is Left. And in the conclusion of that book, because of course people would read the book and be like, okay, this guy must be, he's pro market, he's pro exchange and capitalism, so he must be a conservative, a Reaganite kind. And he goes after Reagan in the conclusion, and he says Reagan is similar to what you were saying, is problematic because the Reagan himself, but also the kind of the Reaganite movement at the time. Remember, this is '85. He's writing this. Co-opted the language of individual freedom, of free markets, but then they bastardized it. They bastardized it both because there was still large scale government in all areas of life, but especially as Lavoie highlighted, the Reagan kind of administration really ramped up the national security sector. And Lavoie's point was that by using that language, it was associating these concepts and principles with a large scale national security state. And those things are fundamentally at odds in Lavoie's telling. I think you can make a similar argument about this. And so to go back to your question though, about progress, I mean, look, it depends what perspective you want to take. On the one hand, you can kind of, if you want to be more pessimistic, which might be right, just because you're pessimistic about something doesn't mean you're wrong about it. Could be justified pessimism. There's still a massive war making state in the United States. I believe war making is still placed on a pedestal where in international relations in general, war making, the ideal of a global hegemon, is still front and center. So really, in some sense, even the progress that has been made are these, a little less here, a little less there. On the other hand, I do think there is reason for optimism from the standpoint that, again, I'm going to stick to America here. And one of the nice things I get as part of my job is to interact with students of a variety of ages, graduate students, but also traditional undergraduate students. And that goes for students here at George Mason, but I give talks around the country as well. So I get to interact with undergraduate students. And I do get the sense that many, not all, and I don't have any firm number to give you in terms of percentage on this, but it's more of a sense, having done this for 20 years, that there is a skepticism of many of them towards government. Part of that is war making itself, like the actual act of invading countries, but a lot of it comes out of the surveillance stuff. It comes out of they recognize things like government efforts to influence and control social media and so on. Now, not all of them. Some come at it from the other perspective. They say, well, you can't have the private corporations, Elon Musk or whomever controlling what's on social media. So you need some kind of government agency to oversee, what is it, Biden's disinformation agency or whatever it was called. Um, and so it's not all of them, but they're at least open to it. And so from that standpoint, I'm hopeful. My own view is that, and this is my view in general with issues, but especially with issues of war, that it's important to study them and think about them and discuss them, but also to move. Don't be concerned with what is, as the economist W.H. Hutt put it, don't be concerned with what is politically possible. So one way to do things is say like, oh no, I'm pragmatic. You're unreasonable. I only talk about things that we can pass with policy in the here and now. But of course, if you do that, then maybe your scope for influencing things is like an inch big, whatever that would be practically. Whereas what you and I think, I don't want to speak on your behalf, what I would want is a much more radical change away from that. But here's the thing. And this goes back to your point about MAGA and the kind of co-opting of the concepts. If that becomes the radical position, then that's the radical position. That's the position but then the radical position is simply like a few less bombs over here, maybe. Where I think we want to discuss things like how can we get rid of the bombs altogether? Let's talk about the war making system itself and think about how to do that. And so my own view is people who are dedicated to those ideas, and not just dedicated in terms of accepting them on blind faith, but thinking about them, critically discussing them, thinking about weaknesses in the arguments, thinking about alternative arrangements that allow people to resolve conflicts without resorting to violence. Those are all really important things. And so my own optimism really flows from where we started this conversation when you asked me about my kind of political views, and I talked about some animating principles about people. But my ultimate optimism in this, and what kind of drives me, is I do believe at deep down that people have the ability to think reasonably and to come up with creative ways of living together. And that is an overarching optimism that drives me, and I that hasn't changed despite the fact that I look out the window and I see human beings doing terrible things to each other on a daily basis. I also see them doing really great things, both individually and towards other human beings. And so it's a matter of thinking about how we can maximize that, but also, I think, getting people to realize that they have the power to do that. They have the
Yeah.
capability to do that. And that's a tough thing for many people to realize, but it's an obvious point once you realize it.
Yeah, I'm still trying to realize it myself. I get very, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen type when like a big intervention is looming. Um, but I don't know. Like you can look at the outbreak of protests before the Iraq War in an incredibly negative way because it was so huge and the war still happened. Or you could say all those people understood that a terrible thing was about to happen and actually tried to do something and express that. And that isn't nothing, certainly.
Yeah, and if you wanted to continue with the pessimism line, you could think to yourself, okay, well, then Bush leaves office, Obama comes in, anti-war protests dramatically plummet. Uh,
Hmm.
uh, Obama wins the peace prize, even though he's, I think if I remember correctly, he's the only Nobel Peace Prize winner who has the distinction of bombing another Nobel Peace Prize winning organization because U.S. drones hit Doctors Without Borders.
When you put
Um,
it that way,
yeah, and so,
my
uh,
goodness.
but again, we can't get stuck in the pessimistic trap. Is my own view because it's too important of an issue to think about it in a deterministic and kind of lock-in effect. So whether that's a naive view or one that just motivates me, it motivates me either way.
I was going to ask about the boomerang effect, but also since that kind of is inspired by the Ratchet Effect, should we explain to the good people what the Ratchet Effect is?
Yeah. Let me start with the Ratchet Effect, and let me start with Bob Higgs, a name you mentioned earlier. Bob Higgs is an economist, an economic historian, and just a wonderful scholar, wonderful person too, I should say. As a self plug, I just earlier this week released a new book called The Legacy of Robert Higgs. It's an edited volume. Some of the names you just mentioned, Nathan Goodman, Anthony Gregory, they are contributors to it, and if readers are interested in learning more about that, and I'm recording a series of podcasts with the authors that are
Hmm.
available free online on the ISSP website, they'll be that we talked about earlier. But Higgs, perhaps the thing that Higgs is most well known for is a book called Crisis and Leviathan, which was published in 1987. And amongst other things in that book, he put forth this ratchet effect theory of government growth to distill down a very nuanced framework. So for listeners who are interested, I do urge you to go pick it up or look up one of Bob Higgs's talks on YouTube where he lays this out because he goes into much greater detail than I'm about to. Think about normalcy. Normalcy is you're going to get some government growth just because the natural nature of government is to grow once it's in place. A crisis situation happens. People, the citizenry demands that government does something. So you get a spike up in government activity. The crisis matures and then eventually comes to an end. Government might shrink, but it never goes back to its baseline level. And the reason it never goes back to its baseline level is twofold. That's the ratchet. The ratchet part of it is
Hmm.
the overall size of government has ratcheted up and remains permanently high compared to the pre crisis situation. The logic that explains that ratchet is twofold. One is the kind of standard logic of government bureaus. You get new government bureaus, they want money, they expand. So you're going to get persistence. But the other interesting aspect, and perhaps the more important of the two features that Higgs points out, is the role of ideology. The role of ideology or belief systems of the citizenry. And what Higgs points out is that part of the reason, or perhaps the main reason, that government is able to grow and sustain is because people are okay with it. They're either indifferent to it or they demand it.
Hmm.
And this is quite powerful way of thinking. This goes back to what you and I were just talking about, even though we didn't put it in these terms, about people realizing their power, their ability to do things without government. So
Hmm.
much of it is we are, certainly in America, I think elsewhere as well, from a young age, we're kind of indoctrinated into this view. The state's out there, the state protects you, the state does all these great things. And then to think differently, you're the crazy one.
Mhm.
No one ever steps back and says, wait a second, I'm not the crazy one. The people that just take this as given, as kind of a fait accompli, that the state has to exist, that the state has to protect me. They're the crazy ones because they're just taking this as a given, kind of on blind faith. And ideology matters for Higgs because it allows this whole thing to work. Like think about a very basic example, but a powerful one. So I have two kids, 5 and 12 years old. They never experienced pre 9/11 life. So just think about something basic like going through an airport. All right, now look, there's always airport security. Well, not always actually, but pre 9/11 there was airport security. They won't be in their life just because they never experienced it, going through airport security, being stopped, being frisked, which in any other area of life would be considered a crime. It would be considered at best obnoxious behavior, and at worst criminal behavior, which is what it is in any other setting. Is just normal. And they'll never get angry like I would because I experienced pre 9/11. That's what Bob Higgs is talking about. And so it becomes normalized in your life. It becomes this is what we were just talking about. This is the way things are. And to question it, you just either don't question it, or the people that question it are the radicals. They're the crazy ones, right? Because they're not just accepting the status quo. And so that there's numerous insights there about the nature of government, the growth of government, but the role of ideology. So my colleague Abby Hall, who we were talking about earlier, and I wrote this book, Tyranny Comes Home, in 2018. It was published, and actually, what inspired that book was Edward Snowden
Mhm.
and the Snowden revelations, because when he revealed what the government was up to, I said, like, this is fascinating. I know this thing called the NSA exists. It was created in the 50s, if I remember correctly, 1952, I want to say, but I don't really know much about it. So I just started reading about it. And of course, like every government bureau, the NSA didn't just fall from the sky one day. It
Right.
was it was the rebranding of prior government agencies. And I realized that you could actually trace back the US surveillance state to the late 1800s, to the US occupation of the Philippines.
Oh
Uh,
man, why is it always that?
uh,
It's the most underappreciated, horrible turning point in American history. That's my new.
Yes, yes,
Yes.
certainly. Understudied, underappreciated, underdiscussed. There's this guy named Ralph Van Diemen who was sent to the Philippines and set up what at the time, again, we're talking here like 1898. So remember the time period, what was considered an extremely sophisticated surveillance system against the insurgents in the Philippines. And again, they didn't have the technology they have today, but they would collect personal information on people, finances, religious life, personal life, sex life, so on, and then strategically use it against the insurgents to punish them, control them, and so on. Van Diemen ends his time in the Philippines, I think around 1900, comes back to the United States, goes into the US military bureaucracy, and starts to agitate to create a similar system domestically based on his experience in the Philippines. At first, he can't really get any traction behind this, but with the onset of World War I, it gave him the opening to set this up. And that's the origins of the NSA. Ralph Van Diemen set it up, and it was intended to be a apparatus that could surveil both American citizens and foreigners in order for the government to control them. So, Abby and I wrote a book called Tyranny Comes Home. Now you can see the name Tyranny Comes Home. You go abroad and people think, no, the government's just going to do good stuff over there to protect us. Well, number one, they do horrible stuff over there. But then, even worse, the people that are involved in that, we call them specialists in social control and violence. So they become specialists in these things, controlling people, using coercion against them. They come back home. And when they come back home, not all of them, but many of them end up where? In Washington, D.C. And just like any walk of life, how do you earn a living? You use the skills you have. You use your what economists call your comparative advantage to do things. And so, like Van Diemen, you get people who are then agitating to do things at home. And the boomerang effect, a well-thrown boomerang returns to the thrower. So that's kind of the imagery here. Foreign policy oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes serves as a boomerang. The US government purports to be doing stuff over there, but it ends up coming home. And so surveillance state, militarization of police, the use of drones domestically, tied up with what? Among other things, the border patrol, as you were
Hmm.
talking about earlier. All of those things can find their origins and roots in various efforts to both prepare for foreign interventions and to actually carry out those foreign interventions. Because we should remember that when the US government intervenes abroad, at least at home, we have some set of rules. They're highly imperfect. The Constitution gets broken every day. People don't, U.S. government officials, they take an oath to uphold the Constitution, but those are words they say. But at least there's something. Internationally, the US government basically faces no rules or consequences for what they do. So they can operate abroad in a largely unconstrained manner legally, and then they bring that home. And so that's the idea behind the boomerang effect. That so there kind of the shift that was taking place in my own thinking. I had written 2 books at the time focusing on how interventions abroad fail and do harm to people abroad. And then I also wanted to start thinking about how those same things adversely and perversely affected people at home as well.
Well, you also have something called Doing Bad by Doing Good. And so that's a little bit different from your other works. I was wondering if you would talk about that. Oh, the subtitle of that being Why Humanitarian Action Fails.
Yeah, that was my second book. So my first book was called After War: The Political Economy of Exploring Democracy. That's what I was mentioning earlier about U.S. military occupation. So again, timing in my own academic career, I was fortunate from the standpoint that timing, uh, even though terrible things were happening, things broke my way. Meaning that I came out of graduate school in 2005, and I came out of my dissertation was on U.S. nation building. So I graduate. I'm on the job market. I'm writing this stuff right when all this stuff is right in the middle of it. So it gave me the opportunity to probably reach an audience or just have a voice that I otherwise wouldn't have had during any other time or many other times. When I was talking about After War, nation building, the nation building book, many people, of course, disagreed because even during 2005, a majority of people, academics in political science and economics, certainly policymakers, were still gung ho about bringing liberty and freedom to all areas of the world through U.S. dominance and imperialism. And so, being skeptical of that in 2005, you were the crazy one.
I remember a
And
little bit.
yeah, yeah, certainly. So, people would say to me, like, look, even if we agree with you, many of them didn't about the nation building stuff. They'd say, surely you think the US government has, this was their prompt to me, certainly you think the US government has a role in the world when it comes to things like humanitarian crises, when it comes to genocide, foreign aid, poverty. And I had a response to that, but it kind of motivated me to then say, okay, let me sit down and think about this and write out what my arguments would look like. And that's why how doing bad by doing good came about. The focus on state humanitarian action, and I ended up by being quite skeptical. Then I still am now of state humanitarian action, and it's an economic book. So it's meaning it's an economic analysis of it. And I start the book by saying that if you look at political policymakers, almost always they justify interventions on moral terms. So they'll say things like, the US has a moral obligation to do X, and then insert grandiose thing over here. And I do think that morality, ethics matter a great deal. But what I wanted to highlight in that book is let's think practically. Why do we want to think practically? Because meaning operationally, like can you actually do stuff? Because economics is not ethics, meaning that economics proper doesn't give you your ethical framework, but it can help you inform your ethical framework. What
Hmm.
do I mean by that? Things that on the face of them appear to have moral weight. So you say the United States government has an obligation to do X. Well, once you actually analyze whether the US government can do X, and then you come back and say they actually can't do it, and there's a good chance they might do real harms, then perhaps things that appear to have moral weight actually have none once you take into account the practical aspects of it. And that's where I came down in doing bad by doing good. I said, even if you think the US government has some kind of moral obligation, which I would be skeptical of if that was my focus, but let's say that you do, there's good reason to believe that more often than not, they're not just going to fail to do what they say they're going to do, but they're actually going to cause more harm than good. The foreign aid they give is going to end up in the hands of the worst people in these societies. You're going to create dependency effects. You are going to dump weapons and other tools of violence into a powder keg, and so on. And therefore, we need to look for other ways to help people. I never deny. Some people have argued or raised the point to me like, "Oh, you're against charity. You're against and nothing could be further from the truth. In some sense, my whole worldview, going back to where you and I started, is grounded in the idea that I'm confident people will help other human beings. That's why we don't need the state to do it. If I thought everyone was terrible and no one was going to help anyone, I still wouldn't want the state because I wouldn't want the most terrible people who aren't going to help anyone in charge. By the way, but I have strong confidence in the ability of people to help others in ways we can't envision ex ante. So what I call for at the end of that book is I say, look, let's pretend, which I'm skeptical of, but let's pretend people in the U.S. government actually want to help the most vulnerable people in the world. There's low hanging fruit here that the U.S. government could do that wouldn't involve giving aid to people, wouldn't involve intervening in other countries. How about, for instance, you remove various barriers that prevent people from peacefully interacting with other people? These are things like immigration barriers. These are things like trade barriers. All of these things represent government imposed barriers between human beings residing in different geographic spaces who want to peacefully associate with each other. But there's a third party, the government, coming in and saying, no, you may not do that. And we're going to stick a gun in your face, either literally or figuratively, to prevent you from doing that. And so that's a very easy way to make people better off. And there's other things you could do as well, but that's kind of the overarching argument, vision, and conclusion of that project.
I mean, if somebody had written a check to Doctors Without Borders for, even a percentage of the cost of the war on terror, how much more good could have been done with that. Like, there are organizations that can help abroad, and it's not government ones, I would say.
Yes, that's right.
Um, Poking a little bit about something you said, I'm curious. This is not very academic, I guess, but do you tend to think that people who do these ridiculous, terrible things are true believers? Um, Most, all, some. Like, did they think not just, haha, I'm going to get that Iraq oil and avenge daddy or whatever the hell W was doing? But did they really think we're going to make this better? Like, we're actually going to fix this country and it'll be like, how much of their own bullshit do they think out of curiosity? Like,
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have any kind of specific percentages to give you, but here's the thing. Back in decades ago, the great Isabel Patterson wrote this wonderful article called "The Humanitarian with a Guillotine." And she started that article with the following line, which I resonates with me. And she says, most of the harm in the world is done by good people and not by accident, lapse, or omission. And I like that because she doesn't deny that there's bad people that want to do harm to others, but there's do-gooders in the world, and they might be motivated by the best of intentions. And they oftentimes cause harm. So rather than giving you my own view on this, here's analytically how I think about it. When I say give you my own view, saying, these people are full of it, these people aren't. Analytically, here's my own strategy for this, which again, some people have misunderstood when they read some of my books because they think I don't think there's any bad people in the world, which I do. Analytically, though, here's how I approach it. I try to take the people I'm engaging with at their word. So in some sense, the easy argument is bad people do bad things, you get bad outcomes. That's true. That's true, but is also kind of uninteresting in a way because it's logically flows.
Mhm.
Here's the novel way to for proponents of militarism, imperialism, empire, and so on. Let's take people at their word and analyze it. So they say, I want to bring democracy, freedom, liberty, whatever nice things they say. Okay, I'm going to take you at your word. Now let's analyze and study how confident we can be that government's actually going to do this thing. What I've tried to show is that even under those first best circumstances, there's good reason to believe that government's not going to be able to deliver on what you say they're going to deliver on. Now, step two is, okay, what happens if the really good people, the ones we gave the benefit of the doubt to, aren't in charge? What actually if you get the terrible people? Well, now you can't do what you say you want to do, and you're going to get horrible, horrible outcomes on top of it. So, to my way of thinking, focusing kind of on the analytically on the first best as a starting point is powerful because it gives the people you're engaging with the benefit of the doubt, and then you can introduce kind of second best, third best sets of assumptions about agent type, the type of people involved, and to think about it. And I've written on this, by the way. I've written about the worst getting on top, to use Hayek's term, kind of language in The Road to Serfdom. In my book, In Search of Monsters, which talks about the U.S. empire, I talk about selection effects. Like, look, who do you think's going to run this thing? It's not going to be the saints in the world.
Are you at all a pacifist? Like, if someone's asking you, in a more personal sort of way, like, would you say yes, no, kind of? If someone just
Yeah.
asks you.
So, I've been thinking a lot about this, so I appreciate you asking, and I do have thoughts on it. And so, my, Abby Hall and I recently wrote a paper called "The Economic Case for Practical Pacifism." To give you a
Mm,
sense of where I stand, I'll say more about
mhm,
that. Uh, you know, so pacifism is one of those words that is very loaded for a lot of people now. It's kind of like where we started with I was saying, well, libertarian, anarcho-capitalist. These things mean different things to different people. And I get why, but if we start broadly, the word pacifism comes from peacemaking.
mhm.
So from that standpoint, I think most people actually would consider themselves a pacifist if we stopped there.
Well,
Now,
yeah.
at least rhetorically, they would. At
Yeah.
least rhetorically, they would, if not always in practice. But the pacifism has come to mean something else as a political philosophy, and so to distill down a complex set of ideas, I view it kind of two. I'm talking pacifism now, two branches. One is absolute pacifism. That's like under no circumstances will I resort to violence. All right. No matter what happens to me personally or internationally, there's violence is inherently and morally wrong. That's the position of the absolute pacifist. Another branch is what is called practical pacifism, and or what the great philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell called relative pacifism, is the term he used. And what that branch holds, if I was to distill it down, that branch of pacifism is that you could envision a situation where you would have to resort to violence, either individually. Some people argue at the state level. So like Bertrand Russell, he said he was a relative pacifist, and there was a couple instances throughout history, modern history, where he could see justification for state intervention for war making, but majority of the cases, no. And so under the practical pacifism category, the default position is nonviolence, but you could envision a case where it was justified. And I find that quite attractive right now with my where I am with my thinking now. And what Abby and I do in the paper I mentioned earlier, the economic case for practical pacifism, is again leverage the tools of economics. And if we just look how the state operates, like the state itself in general, and then as it pertains to war making, you should be skeptical. There's very good reason to be skeptical. And where we conclude is like flipping the burden. Like now, this goes back to our discussion earlier about the anti-war movement. It's a weird situation that I oftentimes find myself in. And I don't know if I assume you experience this too. I'd love to hear it, where you'll be talking to someone. It can be anyone. And let's say they don't agree with us exactly. So it's not one of our close friends who agrees with our views. And uh, 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 you express skepticism towards war, let's say, and they'll say, "Well, what would you do? You tell me what you would do," or almost like making us justify our
Sure.
position, and their position is the default right one.
Yeah, that's true. That's almost always.
Exactly. Same experience I've had. Like we have to justify our position because theirs is the right one. Theirs is the one that naturally exists in some sense. I actually think we should flip that over and push
Hmm.
people to flip. And here's what I mean by that. The practical pacifist says the onus of evidence and the burden of proof, if you will, needs to be on the shoulders of those who are claiming that the state can do these grandiose things, not on those of us who are skeptical about it. And that shift seems it's not just a rhetorical move, it's actually a move for pushing defenders of war making of empire to defend their position. And to defend their position to ensure there's mechanisms in place both that the state can do what they claim it can do, but also that there's lines of accountability, there's people with skin in the game, and so on. One final thing on the pacifism point, I'll just highlight. I think there's an important difference when I said there was a lot of nuances to this within practical pacifism and justified war. I also or defense, I'll call it, or violence. Let me call it violence, justified violence. I think there's a difference between me, the individual, justifying violence, and the state doing it, and people conflate those things. But in to be a little more specific, I think there's a fundamental categorical difference between me being at home at night and someone kicking in my door and sticking a gun in my face, and the threat from China, as if China is an actor, And so I think that's an important distinction. I just wanted to highlight because I fear that when I summarize these things, it kind of lumps all these nuances together. And there's others as well, but that's kind of where my thinking is right now on these issues. And it's something I'm planning to think about, read about, and write about more going forward.
I would like to say that the difference between those two extremes is obvious, but you have to. It's not to people when you're discussing this. I would say the large middle ground between you and China is where it can get hazy. But you get was it a question to was it Michael Dukakis, the thing like what if someone came into your house and like assaulted your wife,
Yes.
and the question was about the death penalty, like truly bizarre, um, but people like to pull that, like, oh, you have some qualms about the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, what if someone came into your house and assaulted your wife?
Right.
There's
Yeah. As if they are analogous and parallel. And then, of course, they make the jump from one to the other. Like, see, you would do something to stop them, therefore, and then they make a leap like we can nuke people.
it's always worse when it's already happened, though, because again, the burden of proof is on you to disprove whatever the current narrative is, even if, such as with the nuking, it has changed a bit over the years, it turns out.
Right, right. So it's already happened. Plus, of course, it forces you to into counterfactual thinking and discussions, which is always difficult too, because then people compare a counterfactual to what actually happened, and it gets messy quickly. But nonetheless, that's kind of the way we have to approach these issues to some degree. But this is part of the reason why I think flipping that burden of proof is so important.
Here's a perhaps too large thing, but and I'm going to differentiate this, but what are your thoughts on revolutions? Because that's usually a doozy to me when I'm talking to more generally leftist people. And I always think about well, see, the Haitian Revolution, probably the most justified revolution you've heard of in a lot of ways, had some very nasty atrocities that happened, and it wasn't, the violence wasn't completely controlled tidily. I would say violence is rarely tidy, and you can get bogged down overthinking that. And I spent most of my life getting bogged down overthinking that. But I mean, if the most justified cause can still get so nasty, how does that mean every revolution is bad and sort of we shouldn't act at all? You know, most CIA assassinations tend to turn of terrible dudes tend to turn out very poorly. Even like, I don't even know. Like, maybe we should just change nothing, I guess. And that sounds flippant, but it's sort of I get stuck there when I'm
No,
thinking about this.
it's a great point you raise and a complicated one. So I don't know if I have a clean 0-1 or black and white answer that's going to satisfy anyone on this topic, but I certainly think you're right. So what do I think about revolutions? Well, I don't know if I have a blanket thought on them
Hmm.
again it gets kind of tricky. So I'm not anti-revolution. I am anti-violence in general. I'm certainly anti violence when it falls upon people that are not directly involved in any way with what is being revolted against. Now, again, even that can be interpreted broadly.
Hmm.
So you go to the Haitian Revolution, for instance, or any violent revolution, you get an uprising.
Hmm.
So people have been oppressed. You get an uprising, and can then what happens when they attack just random civilians from the other side? Now, of course, someone could justify and say, no, they are complicit. It's kind
Hmm.
of a collective guilt type argument. They're complicit because they're part of that society and therefore they had it coming. I personally don't like that because it's not that I don't like it like I don't like Brussels sprouts. I don't like it because I think collective guilt is a form of collectivism. I don't think there's such a thing. I it violates kind of my one of my precepts about normative individualism that
Hmm.
I use to understand the world and that I hold dear as a principle itself. But revolutions aren't necessarily bad for a couple reasons. Number one, even when there's violence, it might target actual people who have done wrong. I am skeptical of violence for the reason you raised, that even when it is perhaps justified in terms of the motivation behind the revolution, almost all acts of large scale violence are going to spill over and target and hit innocent people. Certainly when states do it with war, given the machinery of modern warfare, but revolutions too. And so we always have to be aware of that and think about that. Now, if one can debate about whether a revolution is justified and a net good or not, these things get quite tricky though once you're taking into account the lives and well-being of people. I don't It's hard to add up and do some kind of calculation. But let me just say this: the reason I hesitate to say all revolutions are bad is because not all revolutions are violent revolutions. And so, one of the really fascinating things I think is this idea of nonviolence. And nonviolence doesn't just mean what we were talking about earlier. It doesn't mean that there's an individual pacifist who's sitting at home and they're getting slapped in the face and they just sit there. Nonviolence, there's a and people have talked about this for centuries, different forms of nonviolence. But in contemporary terms, the person who is most associated with nonviolence is a political scientist by the name of Gene Sharp, and he spent much of his career analyzing nonviolent movements. And what he talks about nonviolence, and he's very clear about this, not as a political philosophy. He wasn't a pacifist, and he says you don't have to be a pacifist to leverage nonviolence. Nonviolence is a strategy. It's a proactive strategy, which is if I can come together with other people, so it's a collective action situation, and we can agree. And his point is strategic. He says, look, let's say you live under a repressive state. It is very hard for you to fight a repressive state because you have your fists or rocks, and they
Hmm.
have tanks and bombs and guns. That's tough. You like it, it's very hard for you to go face to face and fight them physically, but you have a lot of power. Why do you have a lot of power? Because you control your person, and all states ultimately require enough acquiescence from enough of the population in order to sustain. They can't sustain otherwise. And so nonviolence, if you can pull it off, and that's an if, not every nonviolent movement is guaranteed to work, but if you can pull it off, what it entails is coming together with other people, recognizing what some people call social power or people power, meaning that I, as an individual, have significant power, so do you. If we both work together with other people and withdraw our power, withdraw our compliance and acquiescence, then the state can't operate. And under certain circumstances, Sharp called this political jujitsu, which is kind of a cool name. He said, but even though it's a really terrible thing, what it is in practice, he says, look, the state might meet your nonviolence, your protest, your noncompliance with violence. And that's the terrible part. But he said it actually can work in your favor if you can stick to your principles. The reason why is it because it reveals to people the true nature of the state, which is a repressive, violent regime, and it can actually ramp up support for your movement.
I believe the civil rights movement benefited greatly from that, from
Yes.
television, because you had, you know, like nicely dressed, like regular people. You had like ladies in their church clothes getting water hosed, and I can always visualize this footage of somebody throwing a brick at a young black man's head, and like the normal people at that time, my understanding is that they were kind of gobsmacked because if you're in the North, you don't really even have to think about segregation a lot of the time. So, yeah, my understanding is that that worked quite well.
Yes, it was a key part of it. Now, there was violent aspects to it, of course, and in reality, there are instances of pure nonviolence, but oftentimes these things get blended. There's elements of violence, so it's never like just like the world. It's never a clean canvas, if you will.
Hmm.
But these are important things, and that's a great example you just highlighted, which is that when you start to see other people as human beings, and then you start to see this entity, the state, and the people that represent the state, saying, "Well, you're standing there, you're not doing what we want you to do, and so I'm gonna harm you," then it really does like pull back the curtain, if you will, on the true nature of the state apparatus. And people realize like, gosh, this is horrible. This is just a horrible setup. And it doesn't guarantee an outcome, but it can set the stage for change. And so from that standpoint, I'm quite supportive of what revolutionaries are trying to do. And I think, at least in principle, it can be entirely consistent with principles of individual dignity, individual freedom, and a respect for other human beings.
Yeah. I've seen over the last decade a lot of internet sort of puncturing of the saintliness of Gandhi. And yeah, some personal flaws, sure, but I almost feel like at this point I need to like I feel the urge to be like, guys, remember Gandhi? That was actually quite impressive that worked. You know, like, and I don't like to say, well, I don't know, the Palestinians need a nice Gandhi or something. It's incredibly easy for me to say that, but I do feel like you see. I almost feel like I don't see it on the table sometimes. The great, like a nonviolent thing. I mean, Palestinians protest. I don't want to be a jerk about that, but just when overthinking leftists are talking about revolutionary stuff from the safety of their college, probably. I don't know. I feel like nonviolence is passe or something.
And it
Unfortunately.
might be it certainly might be the case that it is. Part of it is so pointing out the possibility is not to be prescriptive and meaning that that's what people should do or must do. Or
Hmm.
I always try with all this stuff to be like, look, I have views on this stuff, but I'm, as you just said, I'm sitting far removed from it, and I'm as far as can be as someone that wants to impose my vision on other people. So it's not pointing out that it can work doesn't mean it's possible. But as I mentioned the name Kenneth Boulding before, an economist, one of the great things he always pointed out, he had this concept of the image, and the image is our vision of different parts of the world and what's possible. And so part of that is imagination. Like, can I envision a different state of the world? Can I envision different ways of doing things? And this goes back to what I was saying before. Part of my optimism and why I think the kind of things you think about, the kind of things you talk about, the kind of things you've pursued in your life regarding militarism and war, the kind of things I try to do is part of that, to my way of thinking, is trying to create a vision for people to say, hey, this image exists. Now it might be an outlier image right now. People might think it's crazy, but it's out there. And I want you to be aware of that possibility. What people do with it, that's outside of our control. but at least the image exists and we're thinking about it ourselves and trying to present it to other people. And that might be for certain instances the best we have, but it also might be quite powerful. I mean, all movements, all all people's framing starts somewhere. They start with some realization, some communication, some demonstration of what ideas fundamentally are. And so I view that as an important part of what we do.
I'm wondering your thoughts on, you touched a little bit on media censorship and things, and then we just talked about civil rights stuff, like the power or effectiveness of just seeing violence. Because my kind of understanding about the Vietnam War is that there was an anomalous sort of looseness in coverage. I mean, if you picture the most famous Vietnam War photos, most, there's little girls being napalmed and things like that. And that the press didn't really ever cover a war like that quite again. And obviously, our other association with that war is people being real mad about it in America. And obviously now internet, seeing a lot of footage. I mean, like, what is, like, how much power does simple images have, in terms of seeing violence, especially now with the internet? It might just be an oversaturation now and is less effective than ever.
Yeah, I don't know about relative effectiveness through time. That's a tough one to answer. I'd have to think about that more. But I think images matter. In fact, I know they matter. And how do I know they matter? One of the ways I know they matter is that governments of all stripes invest significant amounts of time, effort, and resources in both curating the images they communicate to people and also concealing certain images from the public.
That is true.
The minute you realize that, you realize why they're doing it because it's important. And of course, authoritarian regimes, what do they typically go after right away? Media, communication mechanisms, photographs that are released, news articles that are released because images matter. And so the question then becomes, how do they matter? And that's context specific. And I certainly think you're right that you can make an argument that with access now through the internet, there's the oversaturation point. But I think more fundamentally, people need to care in a way. One of the challenges for a more liberal view of society, a cosmopolitan view, I'll call it. And I'm liberal. I mean in the traditional sense of the term, not the modern U.S. usage.
Right.
Is simply the idea of empathizing with other human beings, but putting yourself in their shoes, but even more fundamentally, perhaps viewing them as human. It is very
Yeah.
easy to not even think about other people as humans, and governments foster that way of thinking about it. Again, concrete examples. Collectivism, collectivist language you and I talked about. China is doing this to the US. Let's talk about the millions and millions and millions and millions of people that reside in these two geographic spaces. You know, they're not doing anything to Lucy. They're not doing anything to Chris.
Hmm.
They're ordinary people living their life. There are a small group of political elites that are doing stuff on both sides to each other and that are affecting millions of people. So let's, number one, keep track of that, or realize that rather. But then think about like old school propaganda posters when they were made. Think about like World War II propaganda posters. What did the U.S. government, for instance, and this took place on other governments do the same thing. How did they depict Germans, Japanese as insects or rodents? Right? They're rats. They're cockroaches. Why do they invoke that imagery? Because what do you do when there's a bug in your house? You step on it. What do you do when there's a rodent in your house? You kill it. If you're nice, you get it and throw it outside. That's if you're nice.
I put the bugs outside too. That's the way
Yeah,
I was
right,
raised.
right. But you know what I mean. So it dehumanizes people and
Hmm.
makes it easier to view them as. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, the nukes were bad. They weren't ideal, but given what existed, that's what we had to do, kind of thing. Rather than like a sheer horror of doing something like that to another human being.
Hmm.
And it's hard for people to realize, but to think that way, but it's important. Like one of the things an example I used in one of my writings, and it's one of many, is like think about how you felt on, just to Americans, how you felt on 9/11. Now imagine how other people feel. Like, what do you think other people feel when the U.S.
Hmm.
government is dropping bombs? Or, you might say, well, no, the U.S. government has to intervene over there. Well, let's say back, like, go back just the last several years in the U.S. and think of various instances where there was violence. Imagine like the Canadian government or the Afghan government sent troops over to the United States and said, Ferguson, Missouri is a failed state,
Hmm.
and it's chaotic. So we're going to send in the troops to nation build, and we'll leave. We're going to bring you freedom and democracy, and we'll leave when we're ready to leave, and when you're capable of self governance. I imagine that would be met by resistance by Americans. Why? And how do you think other human beings feel when you do the same thing to them? And so when you start thinking in these terms, it's a simple thought experiment, but a powerful one because they're human beings too. They live their lives. They want what's best for their families and their kids. They might hold very different views than we do. They might hold illiberal views.
Yeah, I do find that it's almost a revelation every time, even though I'm always thinking about it. Like, I recently read several 9/11 books, the last couple months, some really, really horrible stuff. I was actually surprised how effective they were after 2 decades of being cynical about 9/11. But like, it's the same thing. It's still explosions and destruction and fire and being trapped. Or when I watched the gut wrenching TV movie from the 80s, Testament, where a mother watches her children die slowly of radiation poisoning, and you don't see that's all it is. It's not really, it's the small story, not the big one. And it would be traumatic enough but I was thinking, like, the government that I pay money to that tries to say, I'm you, you're me, we're all part of this, did that to thousands of parents. And how can you feel good about America if you think too much about that kind of thing? And if nothing else, it's exactly the same. So there's me talking myself back into pacifism again. Or at least there is no way to humanely bomb anything. I will say that that
That's
is
right.
why.
That's right. I mean, look, as one writer put it long ago, war is a crime.
Hmm.
There's no way around it. War requires you to do things that in any other area of life would be considered criminal behavior of the worst, most oppressive, repugnant kind. And so you better be damn sure that you're comfortable doing that, and that the whatever payoff you think it is worth that, because that you can't avoid it.
I haven't covered, and I haven't accidentally made us go on an anti-tanky tangent or anything, but I am curious how you feel and how you've been thinking about the Ukraine conflict a little bit, because to me that's one of those things where one party is reacting more defensively, but that doesn't really tell you what and therefore what. So I don't know how you feel about it and how you feel other people have reacted to it.
Yeah, the normal response is to give some kind of like solution to it, or to identify a cause or the cause, typically a single cause, and then
Hmm.
a single solution. Like if they just did this, so I don't do that because I don't think that is correct or right, and I don't think it's my place to do that. What I'll say is this: I am anti-war, so I think invading people is bad. I think killing people is bad, and I want it to stop. So whatever that entails, getting there as quickly as possible is what I am for. I think attributing blame as if somehow that resolves things. Certainly, people are doing bad things on both sides, no matter what the initial cause was. I don't think the initial cause is as simple as Putin bad. I think again these kind of very simplistic things are too simple. They're too cute in a way and too easy of an explanation. And just like I don't think the solution is just like you can just snap your fingers and finish it, or as Trump says, like one phone call I can end the war. So I the I, to me the very fact that it's happening shows that the system that people put so much faith in, the global system of a hegemon, because people say, of course, like the U.S. isn't strong enough. If the
Mm.
U.S. has exerted more authority, this wouldn't have happened. I think that's the wrong takeaway. So I realize that might be unsatisfactory to people. I'm not avoiding the question, but I am from the standpoint I don't think there's a simple explanation or solution, and I am skeptical of people that give one.
That's fair. Okay, so let's try to do it short if we can, just so I can let you go while wrapping it up. But nukes. Yes, no, sometimes.
So
Weapons, that is, not power, of course.
yeah, Abby Hall and I wrote a paper called "Nuclear Deterrence Melts Down," and it
Mm,
is a paper that tries to point out why we don't think nuclear deterrence, which is the main justification for nuclear weapons now, why it works.
mhm,
I think nuclear weapons and all of their variants since the original first generation nuclear weapon, because they've evolved a lot since then, of course, into subsequent generations. I mean, it is it's a humanly devised weapon that is capable of destroying not just significant portions of the earth in the here and now, but producing things like a nuclear winter
mhm,
that can and will destroy key pieces of ecosystems, the environment, and so on, but also that will directly spill into human well being, and the death and destruction will result well beyond that. The very fact that these things exist and politicians play around with them in terms of the language and rhetoric and threats, I think is horrible. So I'm a fan of disarmament to the greatest extent possible. Now I
mhm.
realize the challenges, the practical challenges of disarmament, and there's tricky nuances to that practically, but that's where I stand on it. In general, weapons, less weapons as compared to more. That's
Mhm.
my view on that.
Yes, and once I realized that we wouldn't dramatically blow up an asteroid that endangered the Earth, and then with nukes, in real life, we would probably try to bump it gently, and therefore there is literally no humane use for nukes. There isn't one. I mean, it doesn't exist. There's no possible contingency where using a nuke is acceptable.
Well, people will say, okay, we don't want to use it. It's just there to maintain peace, and therefore it is humane. That's the deterrence type logic. But of
Right.
course, the response is, in order to deter, you have to be threatened to use. If you're not, if you don't threaten to use it, it has no deterrence value.
It's an absurd. Even now, I still am amazed how much of a game it all is in the
Yes,
most extreme fashion. You have to lie. I mean, you have to say, "I will totally use it. I'm not going to, but I totally would," to just the right amount for this whole thing to work.
exactly, exactly.
I have tried to write about deterrence being overrated. Mostly the Daniel Ellsberg's book about it melted my brain a bit.
The
So,
Doomsday Machine. Yeah,
uh
wonderful book. Yep,
huh. Everyone should read that. Oh,
agreed, agreed.
um, nuclear power. Out of curiosity,
Um,
yes, no.
Nuclear power. I don't think I have a problem with it. I haven't thought about it too much, to be honest. But I've no certainly I don't have the reaction I have with the nuclear weapons.
Sure.
So
Intellectual property, which is a kind of giant, but
intellectual property, that's another good one. I know the arguments on both sides. I don't have like a strong position again on this. I can see the arguments on both sides. Um, but beyond that, so I've read like Stephen Kinsella's critiques of it. I've read
mhm,
arguments in support of it. I'm aware of them, but I don't have a strong position.
okay. Um, uh, Central bank.
Central bank, yeah. I again, it exists. I understand what the function it serves and the distortionary effects. I'm a fan of the possibility of private provision and operation of banking systems. My colleague here at George Mason, Larry White, is one of the key scholars in the free banking movement.
Yes, bring it
Um,
back. I love
yeah,
free banking.
and so that would be my leanings if given the option. Yeah, but given that central banks exist, perhaps the best you can do is some kind of restraint on them, like constitutional restraint. I
Mhm.
think that will break down, but I think it's like any other aspect of government from that standpoint.
Do you have a favorite political or economic figure who is wrong about most everything?
Wrong. I don't know if they're wrong about everything. Here's one that I read a lot of and I find inspiring. So I disagree with him a lot. I like Noam Chomsky a lot
Sure, yeah.
on war on economics. I think he's quite wrong on many things. I think oftentimes the language he adopts is quite sympathetic to other regimes, meaning that I don't want to overstate it, but sometimes I get the sense that he dislikes the American empire so much that he's willing to grant certain space or give passes to atrocities by other governments and their war making. I don't like that. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. So I think you can critique the American empire while staying consistent in critiquing other governments. But I find a lot to like in him. I find a lot to like in him about his analysis of war making, imperialism, propaganda. I think these are quite powerful and insightful things.
Um, do you have not just an influence, but a hero or heroes?
Well, my parents I'd highlight, but intellectual heroes, just to name some off the top of my head, people that I find inspiring: Richard Cobden, Herbert Spencer, William Graham Sumner. I mentioned Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek, Murray Rothbard, Robert Higgs, who we talked about
Mhm.
earlier. All these are intellectual heroes to me. My colleague Pete Betke, who was my teacher and changed my life by introducing me to his ideas. He's my other intellectual hero that I want to make sure I highlight.
Poor Spencer. I've read a single article, possibly in Reason, about how his legacy is totally tainted with the social Darwinism. Is that what I mean?
Right, right.
Yeah, and how that's not what he meant, guys.
No, it's not so what he meant, but it all. Even if you think that's what he meant and you don't like that, just put that. He has great stuff on how war making and militarism is a form of collectivism, how it destroys a free society, undermines liberty, and from that standpoint, I find his readings insightful. Again, even if you don't agree with all of it, just like we were just talking about Chomsky, I think there's lots of important insights in there.
And do you have a favorite fictional anti-war book and or movie?
Well, Doctor Strangelove is the classic.
Hmm.
Slaughterhouse Five is wonderful as far as books go. So if I like Orwell as well as others. But that might be a common one people point out. He's good. But those are the ones I'd highlight.
Yeah, those are. This is not the lightning round, but did you ever read the um? It's not Slaughterhouse Five. It's the sort of non-fictional Vonnegut essay about what it was like to be in Dresden at the time.
I
Um,
did not, but I should. I mean, he was in war, right? He was writing about his personal
he
experiences.
was there
Yeah,
during the raid,
yeah,
and I think that essay wasn't published until pretty late in his life. But you can't accuse him of being pro-Nazi, but he also has a perspective that is very powerful and very not seen very much. I'm always refighting World War II in
yeah. I'll
one
have
way
to
or
check that
another.
out because I have not read it. So
Um, and producer Chris has added to the list Turnstile, which is a band.
oh yes, yes. He likes Turnstile. I like Turnstile too. That's our one of our shared
um,
likes.
okay. And actually, we had questions about Rothbard and Chomsky, which we have indeed hit. Now, I guess the final one is which Rothbard, because in my book there are 4 or 5 of them.
Well, I don't know which
Some,
number you'd put, but the ones my favorites are 60s and 70s. So
yeah,
so
that's.
For a New Liberty, which is 1973, I believe,
Hmm.
had an enormous impact on my thinking about political philosophy in general, but war making.
Hmm.
I do think he is like Chomsky. I think he at times in that chapter is too soft on the Soviets.
Hmm.
He makes these claims like the U.S. has killed more than the Soviets, which might be true empirically, but my own view is like would be something. If I was, now it's not my book, but if I was talking, I'd be like these governments collectively kill a lot of people, and why did they kill them? Well, because let's think about how states act. So, talking about kind of a comparative, one's better than the other, I don't like so much, but that's awesome. And then his stuff on just war in the state, like the formation of the state, the conquest theory of the state. um, I love it. I find it quite powerful, and so on. His shift later on in the '90s, and I'm not as big of a fan. There's not that It's not that I don't like anything he wrote during that time period, which is why I'm saying I'm not as big of a fan. There's a lot of stuff I don't find attractive intellectually, but that doesn't mean it's zero.
Hmm. Here's a question we always ask that well, you're more economic, so how would I get a cappuccino in your imagined political utopia?
How would you get a cappuccino?
How would I acquire one?
Well, you'd go to the coffee shop, which would be, I imagine, localized and very unique in its structure, because it wouldn't be a homogenous coffee shop per se. And you'd sit there and drink your coffee and talk about the issues we've been talking about and other pressing issues in political philosophy, whether it was with me or someone else. And I'd
All
join you,
right.
by the way, because I love coffee as well. So I'd be happy to join.
All right. That's a good utopia. Do you have three media recommendations? I don't know, like I'm a like a general, look at something, a more accessible look, in reference to some of the things we've discussed. Something that people should check out that you didn't write, and maybe isn't the entirety of the Wealth of Nations or something.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is going to sound somewhat. Most of the listeners who are listening to this, I imagine, will be familiar with this. But my go-to on a regular basis: antiwar.com, Libertarian Institute, Quincy Institute. Those are the kind of three things kind of the popular media, accessible media, I should say, not popular enough, but accessible media place where I go for things that we're talking about. I also follow. I try to. I think it's important for all of us to, and I realize this wasn't the question, but I'm going to mention it, to keep an open mind to recognize what other people are arguing. So I will also read on a regular basis foreign affairs, foreign policy, national interest, American conservative. Some of the stuff in there at times I like. Much of it I'm like, oh my. But it gives me a sense of what other people are saying about these issues, which I like a lot. And so I always try to be aware of that and consume it, and I use it in my own head and with my some of my colleagues as kind of a thought experiment. Like, how would I respond to this? What would my position be if someone laid out this argument to me? And that's a good way to think about things.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a world of more and more paywalls, but people should definitely do that as much as they can.
Yep.
You know, where can our listeners find you on the internet?
Yeah, the main place I guess would just be my personal website, which is Ccoyne, so CCOYNE.com, and that's my professional website, and it has my writings, my media stuff, my a link to the initiative for the study of stable peace that we talked about earlier, and so for anyone interested, that's kind of the central hub, ccoin.com, and everything else will be linked there.
I will say that at least during the last week or two, several of your books were very affordable on Kindle on Amazon, which for academic books isn't always the case. So if they happen to still be affordable, our listeners could totally go check those out if they wanted to.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, the Independent Institute published the last couple, and they're wonderful in making things affordable and accessible. So I am grateful to the Independent Institute, which is another place people can check out. They don't focus on war per se. They do civil liberties and war making is part of what they do, but not their whole focus.
Yeah, I did a conference there many years ago. And that's where I met Anthony Gregory, who technically is the person who made me start self-describing as an anarchist. So that was a pretty substantial influence,
Oh,
technically,
wow. Yeah, certainly.
on my
Certainly.
life. um, well, I guess obligatory plug for non-Serviam and me all over the dang internet, Twitter, Blue Sky, Mastodon. I'm not on Instagram, but we are on Instagram. Follow us all over. We like it. Chris, this was a lot of fun. You have made my day much better. Just thinking about very serious things, but remembering there are people like you out there to talk about these things with. So I appreciate you coming on very much.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. And likewise, I very much enjoyed speaking with you and talking about these issues. So thanks for the opportunity.
Maybe we'll get you again on sometime if you'd be
I'd love
interested.
it. Thank you.
All right. You're listening to the Non-Serviam Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe over on our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us across social media on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon. If you're extra interested in seeing this project continue, consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com. But if you can't contribute financially, we still like you a whole lot. And you can help us out just by liking and sharing this episode or any other one that catches your fancy. As always, shout out to our existing patrons. Your support helps us reach a larger audience and helps keep this project alive. Thanks so much.